Last time I read something about my grandmother Mitchell in her victory garden and her crow named Martha and a dog named Rusty. And this is a continuation that comes right after that in the memoir I'm writing. And it's about my grandmother Mitchell's sister, Aunt Nellie. The title of the piece is Aunt Nellie and the Big Berry Stadium Incident. 2 or 3 years after Grandpa Mitchell died, Graham Mitchell gave up the family home at 44 Bark Street and moved to a cottage next door to my parents in the small town of Somerset across the river from Fall River. Now in her late 60s, she was still quite vigorous. Her propinquity was a godsend for my working mother, who needed help with her 3 small children and me. I was 12. Oblivious to my siblings, and spending my idle hours riding around town on my bike with pals. Graham held the fort, cooking, doing the laundry, and keeping an eye on 7-year-old Peter, who spent much of his time killing frogs and tormenting the twins, Kathleen and Maureen. When I was in 7th grade, I began sleeping over on a daybed in her bungalow, away from my bothersome siblings. I was an altar boy, and on many mornings she and I walked together to 7 o'clock Mass, after which she made me a poached egg and bacon while I watched the Today Show. We talked a lot. I was deeply curious about her youth in Canada, the wolves that howled, the bears that marauded, the Mohawk Indians, and the clear, bottomless lakes that surrounded her farm. Graham was born on a farm in the Laurentian Mountains, about 50 miles north of Montreal, and migrated to Fall River with her family. Like many Quebec families, hers came south in the early years of the 20th century to work in the bustling spinning mills of southeastern Massachusetts. Every couple of weeks, I went with Graham to visit Aunt Nellie, her older sister, and Aunt Nellie's husband, Uncle Sidney Ellis. They're a large family who lived a few blocks away. I'm not sure exactly how many children Aunt Nellie had, either 17 or 18. Graham said she'd lost several as well. Her oldest son, then in his 40s, was Big Bob, so called, I surmise, to distinguish him from Aunt Nellie's youngest son, a high schooler named Little Bob. At some point, I became curious about there being 2 sons named Bob and asked her why. She told me straight away, I always liked the name. The Ellis house was crammed with Nellie's offspring and their offspring, my second cousins. It was a small house, dark and smoky. All the family, save Nellie and her husband Sidney, a pipe smoker, favored Pall Malls. For many years, Nellie prayed that a picture window would be installed, and eventually her children chipped in for one. Unfortunately, it didn't admit much light as it looked out on the brick wall of the house next door. No matter, the family lit up their smokes and pointed with pride at their impressive addition, a post-war status symbol. Some of the Ellis children had jobs at the mills. Some had moved away, but they were still poor, so much so that in the summertime, one or another of the clan stopped by once a week at 44 Bark Street, and Graham Mitchell filled a basket with vegetables from the Victory Garden. In the springtime, the Ellis children came en masse to Bark Street and picked the dandelion greens from the lawn for a depression salad. Preston, one of the older sons, lost his mill job, and during the hard years of the 1930s, made his living as a rag and bones man, known to everyone in the neighborhoods off Eastern Avenue by his plangent call. Any rags, any bones, any bottles, as he trundled his cart about. Their father, Uncle Sidney, was a dour gent, employed at the Fall River Waterworks, an impressive granite building built not long after the Civil War and situated in a large body of spring-fed fresh water, Watuppa Pond. Reputed to have the clearest, cleanest drinking water in New England, the pond and surrounding watershed area was and is, to this day, fenced off and patrolled to keep out poachers and fishermen. My uncles bragged about climbing the fence on dark nights to swim and fish, and told tales of bass, perch, and tiger muskies, so plentiful they would jump in your boat. When he wasn't off on a toot, Uncle Sidney was the chief breadwinner and made a good paycheck as a hydraulic mechanic. In a loop on his wide leather belt, he always carried a slender, intricate instrument. It was, my uncles explained, a tool for regulating the flow from ports and sluiceways. When I first knew him, he was already retired, but still proudly wore the leather belt with a loop for his special tool. As my mother and her brothers told it, Sidney's earlier life followed a seasonal rhythm. He would impregnate Aunt Nellie in the fall and then disappear before she came to turn, leaving on a Homeric bender, returning haggard, broke, and bedraggled, and looking, my mother said, like the wreck of the Hesperus, a reference to the famous Longfellow poem about the schooner Hesperus that sailed the wintry sea. Several weeks had passed, and now there was a new baby in the cradle. The family, now slightly more impoverished, always took Sidney back, although with less and less enthusiasm as time went by. Sidney held to this pattern through Nellie's 20-plus pregnancies over the better part of 3 decades. First the rutting season, then the drinking season, and then rehab. I don't know how he kept his job, but he did. Apparently few could employ the hydraulic instrument quite so deftly as he. There was some sub-rosa chuckling about Sidney's tool among my uncles, but I couldn't quite put it together at the time. But when I knew Uncle Sidney, his working days were over. Now he sat in his chair, morosely smoking his pipe, which he lit by striking a wooden match on the leather patches of his bib overalls. Not infrequently, he dropped a lit match on his lap. Aunt Nellie, sitting across from him on a large, overstuffed sofa, would croak, "Sidney's on fire!" And the nearest person would extinguish his smoldering crotch with the bucket of water kept next to his chair. Then everyone, save Sidney, would laugh, and Aunt Nellie would smother me in her massive bosoms. Another oft-told story about Nellie's family concerned the infamous Big Berry Stadium incident, which took place when my mother was pregnant with me on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1941, about a month before Pearl Harbor. According to newspaper reports, on a chilly afternoon, Preston, one of the Ellis boys, and his friend Bill Barlow, and about a dozen of their cronies got together for a drinking party in the hobo jungle adjacent to the Big Berry Stadium. Long gone now, the Big Berry was where the citizens of Fall River attended stock car races and baseball games for many years. The stadium stood close by the place where the Quequechan River ran into Mount Hope Bay. Quequechan in the Wampanoag language means falling river, thus the name of the city. As the AP Wire story explained, the Big Berry group purchased several jugs of moonshine from 2 guys peddling them on a street corner near a garage, and then circulated the word to the gang to get together for a party. The celebrants were mainly unemployed or worked for the WPA, the Federal Works Progress Administration. One of the group, identified only as, quote, a durable survivor, stated that when he woke up, all he could recall was that the booze was top-notch. But before the weekend was over, 9 of the drinkers were dead, and others were hospitalized. The jugs, it turned out, contained denatured alcohol, or antifreeze, which is made from ethylene glycol. During the early part of the 20th century, antifreeze, because of its sweet taste, was often used as a murder weapon. Ethylene glycol is extremely difficult to detect in the body, which often leads to incorrect diagnoses. The symptoms, including abdominal cramps, cracked lips, diarrhea, and vomiting, can be confused with other illnesses. Because of its agreeable taste and relatively sluggish action in the digestive and renal systems, the victims are first unable to explain to the hospital staff what has happened to them. They're too drunk. On the second day, the ethylene glycol begins to crystallize in various parts of the body, including the lungs and brain, which turns the drinkers into gibbering idiots. Death, which is often extremely painful, is caused by massive kidney damage after 72 hours. The culprits who sold the jugs, the two gas station employees, claimed that they believed the contents to be moonshine, probably bagaquira, made by the local Portuguese from grape skins and stems. They were arrested immediately. This all took place just a few weeks before the US Congress declared war on Japan and national mobilization was underway. The two men pled guilty to manslaughter and the judge gave them a choice: 4 years in jail or enlist in the Army. They took the latter. There are at least two Big Berry survivors. One was my cousin Preston, whose name everyone recognized was damnably congruent with the largest selling antifreeze then and now, Prestone. The other survivor, Bill Barlow, was blinded, but otherwise whole. But Preston was physically and mentally untouched by the experience, perhaps the aerobic benefit of hauling his rag wagon up and down the stony hills of Fall River. He gained for a time a measure of local fame, but soon, with the war on, it was forgotten, except by my uncles, who marveled at Preston's impervious constitution. Whenever I saw Preston pulling his wagon down Bark Street, I wanted to say something to him, but I could never come up with the appropriate felicitation. We just waved. Bill Barlow, on the other hand, was lauded far and wide for surviving the Big Berry Stadium disaster, even though he was now entirely sightless. His enduring fame was probably the result of his new name. For the rest of his long life, he was known to one and all as Durable Bill. My sisters Kathleen and Maureen read what I have just read to you and called me to add one more story about the family. It occurred, I believe, a few years before Big Berry. One day, Graham Mitchell was visiting her sister, Nellie, and Nellie announced that she was pregnant once again. Uncle Sidney, who was older than Nellie and must have been in his mid-50s by then, but obviously still randy and potent, Graham walked over to his chair, picked up the water bucket, and threw its contents in his face. "Keep away from Nellie," she said. He did. It was her last pregnancy, but not her last child. Little Bob, it turned out, was Big Bob's son, taken in by Nellie when the unwed mother deserted. Thank you.